Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Program. I am not Thom Hartmann, as you can see, but I am Rebecca Vallas, and I'm sitting in for Thom today, who is away. The Kobach Commission, the Pence Kobach Commission, or as Let America Vote's Jason Kander has dubbed it, the Voter Suppression Committee to Elect the President, I love that and I like to use it all the time, is back in the headlines this week with some very public clashes and a healthy dose of fake news from its eponymous vice chair, Chris Kobach. With me in studio to unpack the latest on the Kobach Commission is Liz Kennedy. She's a friend, she's a colleague, she's the Director of Democracy and Government Reform. I think that's the first time I've ever gotten your title right. At the Center for American Progress. You can follow her on Twitter at LizKennedy_. Liz, thanks so much for joining the show. So what's going on with this commission?
It's my pleasure to be speaking with you, but unfortunately about really a threat to our democracy. This is a sham election commission. They had their second meeting on Tuesday. And the goal of this commission, really, they've staffed this commission entirely with people who've, many of whom have spent their careers perpetrating a toxic myth of widespread voter fraud, although much of any of the so-called evidence or even assertions of this voter fraud comes from these commissioners themselves. And really, these kinds of toxic myths have been used in recent years to push voter suppression tactics that are preventing Americans from voting for no good reason. And it is extremely dangerous. So this commission is federalizing the wave of voter suppression we've seen, really attacking principally communities of color, but really keeping all sorts of Americans from being able to participate in our self-government.
Now, Jason Kander calls the commission the Voter Suppression Commission to Elect the President. Trump would disagree. He likes to call it the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. And of course, he established this commission back in May. Remind us the background on it and what its actual charge is and what it's been up to since it was put in place.
Sure. It came out of President Trump's fever dream, that one of the very first assertions that he came out with, apart from the fact that his inauguration crowds were supposed to be so big, was that but it was like part and parcel. This was the first time that he's the president. First, he's lying about the inauguration crowds. Then he's lying about 3 to 5 million illegal votes being cast, and maybe he would have won except for these millions of illegal votes.
Or the popular vote anyway, because unfortunately he did win. Well, at least technically.
Would have would have won the vote totals.
Right.
And that it's really, so it's just, he was leaning on this like completely debunked study, and that's anything that has ever been put forward in terms of data has very quickly been able to be totally debunked. As you said, Kobach, started this new meeting with an announcement about potential illegal votes in New Hampshire and how they potentially swayed the election, which then anyone with academic credentials or, faith in the process and who isn't out to find this fraud.
Anyone who cares about facts.
Anyone who cares about facts.
Can I just go that far?
The Bush Justice Department in 2004 and some of these people worked there, did extensive work to try to uncover any cases of voter fraud and utterly failed. There have been like 31 actual cases out of, some say, billions votes cast, in the last decades. You're more likely to get struck by lightning. But the problem is we're talking now about these toxic myths, but what is actually moving forward are these policies that, Rebecca, are akin to the new Jim Crow. These are, facially neutral. Oh, just show an ID. But you forget that a lot of people don't actually have ID, and you shouldn't have to have this kind of ID, to actually cast a ballot. 300,000 people in Wisconsin didn't have the kind of ID that would have been required by their law. 600,000 people in Texas wouldn't have had that ID. And that law recently struck down. A federal court, again, for the 8th time since 2011, found that Texas had been involved in intentional racial discrimination with their voter ID requirements. So we know what this is really about.
We know what this is really about. It's as you said, a sham commission. It's not actually about election integrity. It's about popularizing the myth that has been debunked so many times. You must be banging your head against the wall and quite tired at this point, Liz.
See my prior work.
See all of Liz's prior work to see why that's not true. But the fireworks this week, you actually just referenced what was going on there. Chris Kobach penned an op-ed in Breitbart. And it was a fiery op-ed that doubled down on Trump's claims about 3 to 5 million alleged undocumented folks voting in the election, which he claims cost him the popular vote because he doesn't seem to like facts or care about them all that much. And in this case, what Chris Kobach is actually alleging in his op-ed is that Senator Maggie Hassan won her New Hampshire Senate seat on the backs of illegal votes. What he says are people who were actually out-of-state voters who didn't have New Hampshire driver's licenses and they shouldn't have voted in this election. Should we be taking those concerns seriously, and why not?
Not at all. All he has discovered is that when you look at where those out-of-state licenses were used, they are almost all college towns. So all he has discovered is that college students vote in New Hampshire, which of course they do. It is completely legal. There is a technical legal distinction between domicile and residence. And so you can, be abiding by all of the necessary laws in order to be an eligible voter voting eligibly in New Hampshire. And then possibly, there might have been some like motor vehicle infraction if these people were still driving and didn't update an out-of-state driver's license. But that has nothing to do with illegal voting.
And with whether they were eligible to vote in the New Hampshire election.
But just wait, there's more.
Just wait, there's more.
That's, barely a third of the fireworks from this week's commission. We also then found out through the grace of FOIA that commission member Hans von Spakovsky wrote an email to someone that it ended up at the Justice Department, but wrote an email where he was saying about this commission before it was formed, for this commission to serve its purposes, there should be no Democrats on it, I think he said no mainstream Republicans, and that academics would only hold up the purpose of the commission.
I think I missed the part about mainstream Republicans.
Oh, yeah.
No mainstream Republicans.
Yeah, they're just going to whatever, they're going to prevent the purpose of this commission. Meanwhile, Vice President Pence is out there saying, we've got no preconceived conditions, but, view on any of these things. But actually, Hans von Spakovsky was then appointed to be one of these commissioners. He's one of the most famous of all of the, and of course, when...
You should remind people who he is, right?
Well,
Hans von Spakovsky, apart from having one of the hardest to say names that I've ever had to say on radio or television.
Bond villain.
He kind of needs the mustache. But apart from his fantastic name, remind us who he is, because he has a long history working on these issues.
Well, he was formerly a member of the Bush Justice Department, where he attempted to push these voter fraud cases and try to uncover all of these things. So he has really been out for finding these unsuccessfully for years. And I might say I actually debated him at a college at one point it's just, you're presented with these things that aren't data, but then you have to spend all of your time debunking these, if you don't know that actually the claims about illegal Somali voting in Minnesota is something, then you say, hey, what? No, you have to say no, as we all know, none of those people were actually convicted, et cetera, et cetera. And it stops us from moving forward with important reforms like automatic voter registration, which is a secure, modern, and common sense way to keep our registration up to date.
In the next segment.
But that's so the fact that Hans von Spakovsky told a reporter that he didn't write that email when asked at the commission. Then Heritage, where he was working at the time, then had to come out and admit that he had written that email.
The email saying no mainstream Republicans.
This is the email saying no mainstream Republicans.
Or Democrats, or anyone who cares about
and
facts.
Academics. No academics. Should be, essentially should be on the commission. So it just lays bare the real purpose of this. And then I have to say, because our friend who works on gun violence prevention was really sharing with me that one of the witnesses they called, John Lott, is famously a purveyor of junk science in fighting common sense gun violence safety measures. And now he's taking his work. He's, an ex-academic. He was relying on a study that wasn't even published from 2006, and then coming in to say voters should be subjected to a federal criminal background check in order to vote.
This being, of course, someone who doesn't want to see background checks when it comes to gun ownership.
Yes, so he thinks he's being very clever, but it really just shows the absurdity of this entire endeavor and the fact that at a time when we face real dangers in terms of election security and foreign threats and lack of participation, and, the fact that this commission went out to ask for all of the voter registration data from all the 50 states, people started suddenly deregistering to vote, giving up their own right to their. So it's dangerous. It's already having bad consequences, but, we can fight it and we will win.
So a very, very public clash this week following that Breitbart op-ed. Actually, despite what Hans von Spakovsky, which if you say it slowly, you can say it correctly, I just learned, despite his wishes not to have any Democrats, mainstream Republicans, or academics on the commission, there is actually a Democrat on the commission. His name is Bill Gardner. He's the Secretary of State in New Hampshire. And he saw this op-ed in Breitbart that Kobach penned, and he said, nuh-uh. I actually happen to know that those election results were real and valid. And by the way, you seem unfamiliar with the law in New Hampshire that you were just describing.
Very much. And so Kobach did after. That's always the thing. They light a fire and then they step back. So he said, oh, maybe I didn't know what verb to use when I said that they did vote illegally. And he, of course, it must be said, is a paid contributor to Breitbart. So while being the Secretary of State of Kansas, he is also paid by this alt-right website to spew this false information that is endangering the fundamental rights to engage in self-government of, every American citizen. And I think that's really the question.
Not just an ideological motivation, but actually a paid self-interest in continuing to fan these flames. So more.